I decided to surprise my son, used the spare key, and quietly slipped into his apartment. He didn't notice me until I saw who was sitting on his lap and what they were saying about me. I was frozen. Subscribe to the channel and share your stories in the comments. And now let's get started. A week before her birthday, my daughter told me, "The best present would be if you just died." She didn't scream it. There was no dramatic slap of a door, no storming out of a room. Lauren said it like she was ordering a drink. Soft, casual, even a little distracted. Her voice was syrupy and bored. Her thumb scrolling on the glossy screen of her phone as though I were nothing but background noise. It was Tuesday evening. She sat at the gleaming marble island in her kitchen, one bare foot curled over the other, a half-full glass of Sauvignon Blanc catching the last of the Texas sun. I stood at the sink folding the twins' laundry, shirt still warm from her dryer, feeling like an unpaid maid in a house whose walls I had paid for. I froze. "What did you say?" My voice sounded small even to me. Without lifting her eyes, she repeated it. "I said the best present would be if you just died. Less drama." A quick, humorless laugh slipped from her lips. "You'd call it peace, Mom. I call it boundaries." I stared at the back of her head. The blonde highlights, my Christmas gift to her, $280 at the salon she liked, caught the light like tiny wires. She had been a premature baby, 5 pounds at birth, so fragile the nurses had called her our little bird. I remembered feeding her with an eyedropper when she refused bottles, holding her feverish body against mine night after night. Now she was 45, telling me my death would be the best gift. I swallowed the air like water. My hands kept folding shirts automatically. Fold, stack, fold, but something inside me was cracking quietly without witness. On the morning of her 45th birthday, I still went. Habit is a kind of hypnosis. I convinced myself maybe she'd regret her words, that maybe she'd see me at the door with the cake and remember I was her mother. I stood there at 8 a.m., holding a $300 cake from the French patisserie she liked. Chocolate ganache, gold leaf trim, 24 candles already arranged. I'd even worn my best blouse, ironed the night before. My hands trembled a little as I knocked. She opened the door barefoot in a pale silk robe, the smell of expensive body lotion drifting out. Her hair was pinned up carelessly, like a woman on vacation in her own life. "Oh," she sighed, looking at me as one looks at an inconvenient delivery. "It's you." No hug. Not even a thank you for the cake. We sat in her immaculate living room, the one I had partly financed, me clutching the cake box on my lap, her scrolling her phone, muttering words like space and freedom and your drama. It sounded rehearsed, like a speech her therapist had coached her to deliver. Then she said it again, this time slowly, clearly, as if savoring the syllables. Her birthday wish, my disappearance. My death. The world stopped moving. The hum of the refrigerator, the muted sounds of cartoons upstairs, even the light seemed to thin. I, Evelyn Parker, 75 years old, realized in that instant that I wasn't simply unappreciated. I was disposable. I rose from her plush sofa. "Happy birthday," I murmured, my voice steady but foreign to me. I left her house with the melting cake still in my hands, but not holding the usual excuses I rehearsed for her. Something inside me, the part that had bent, stooped, smiled for 45 years, snapped clean. The role I had played was over. Back in my apartment, the cake sat on the counter like a relic from a world that had vanished. The frosting glistened under the harsh kitchen light. I stared at it for a long time, then opened the closet where I kept my proofs. 3 cardboard boxes, labeled in my careful handwriting. College. Wedding. House. They weren't mementos. They were receipts, my life in paper form. I carried them to the table and began to open them, one by one, as though performing an autopsy on my own past. There was the paycheck stub from the month Lauren had pneumonia. I'd worked triple shifts at the nursing home so she could stay in a better hospital. Lost wages. $2,100. There was the receipt for the $900 prom dress, the one she had cried over in the fitting room, saying everyone else would look better. I'd bought it without hesitation, promising myself I'd skip my dentist appointment. 3 major changes in college, $47,000 in tuition, a $45,000 wedding in the Hill Country, complete with string quartet and open bar, a $250,000 down payment on the house she now called hers, not ours. 8 months of mortgage when Mark lost his job. $4,000 for the twins' braces. Thousands for gas, groceries, car repairs, baby clothes, endless gifts. Babysitting every weekend so they could reconnect as a couple. I kept adding until the ink on my calculator tape looked like a confession. More than $560,000. Adjusted for interest, over $700,000. $700,000. 4.5 decades. One daughter who now wished me dead. It wasn't bitterness that washed over me. It was a cold, clinical clarity like a doctor reading a chart. Love without boundaries isn't love. It's a mortgage on your own soul. I picked up the phone. My hand was steady now. Did you really mean it? I asked. On the other end, her voice was sharp, almost impatient. Yes. Respect my boundaries. I understand, I said and hung up. But this time I didn't sit down and cry. I didn't call a friend to explain. I didn't rehearse excuses for her cruelty. I sat at my kitchen table with the boxes of receipts spread like evidence, and I decided to act. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the glow from the streetlight cutting thin silver lines across my walls. The boxes of receipts were still open on the table, a paper graveyard of my own sacrifices. The cake sat untouched on the counter, its candles like little accusing fingers. At first I felt only grief. A grief so heavy it pinned me to the mattress. I replayed Lauren's words again and again. The best present would be if you just died. Each time the phrase landed differently. A knife. A verdict. A release. Somewhere around 3 a.m. The grief turned into something else. Not anger. Not yet. Strategy. A cold, focused, almost mathematical calm began to rise inside me. The way it had when I used to balance my checkbook after midnight while Lauren slept upstairs as a child. If she wanted me dead, if she wanted my drama gone, then she could have it. Not my life but my role. Not my breath but my bank account. I got out of bed and walked barefoot to the kitchen. The linoleum was cold under my feet. The receipts were still spread out like a battle map. I sat down and took a pen. On a yellow legal pad I wrote 2 columns, what I give and what they take. Under give I wrote, money, time, babysitting, house security, emotional labor. Under take I wrote, respect, gratitude, my health, my dignity. I stared at the columns until the words blurred. Then I circled the last item under take. My dignity. I whispered aloud. No more. By sunrise the plan had taken shape. Not a revenge plan. A survival plan. I would quietly shut down every financial artery they fed on. I would build a wall of paper, legal, financial, emotional, and step behind it. No screaming, no fights. Just signatures. At 8 o'clock I was already at the bank. The branch manager, Mr. Lawson, had known me for years. He used to joke about how predictable I was, always arriving with my transfer slips like clockwork. When he saw me that morning he smiled automatically, then paused. Mrs. Parker? Are you all right? I'm fine, I said. I need to close the joint emergency account I have with my daughter. He blinked. Are you sure? That account? I'm sure. We went into his office. He clicked at his computer, printed forms, slid them across to me. My signature looked strange, harder, darker. As if someone else were writing for me. $30,000 transferred back into my name. The first artery closed. When I walked out of the bank, the January air felt sharp and clean. My phone buzzed in my bag. I didn't look. Next stop, the mortgage office. Because my name was on the papers as cosigner, I had rights. Mark's new unemployment had already caused missed payments. I had seen the notices on their counter. I sat down with a weary but polite loan officer and asked exactly what would happen if defaults continued. She explained it all, sliding brochures toward me. I took notes. You're very prepared, she said. I've had 45 years of practice, I answered. By noon I was at my lawyer's office. Ben Carter had been my attorney for years. A man with a gentle voice but a predator's precision when he read contracts. He looked up from his desk and frowned. Evelyn? You never come without an appointment. I need to rewrite my will, I said. Today. He motioned me to sit. Tell me. And I told him. Not the whole story, not the cake or the words, but the structure of my decision. Everything to a children's charity. A trust for the grandkids locked until age 25. Life insurance beneficiaries changed. The emergency account closure documented. Papers prepared for seizing the house if payments stopped. Ben listened without interrupting, only occasionally making small notes. When I finished, he tapped his pen against the pad. "You're sure?" "I'm done funding my own erasure." He gave a small approving nod. "Then let's do it." We spent hours drafting, signing, notarizing. Each signature felt like pulling a nail out of my own flesh. But each one also felt like a stitch closing a wound. By 3 in the afternoon, everything was in motion. The charity, the trust, the new insurance. I had built my wall. Driving back to my apartment, I noticed my hands on the steering wheel were steady. For the first time in years, no tremor. At home, the cake had collapsed under its own weight. I threw it in the trash. I made tea, sat at the table, wrote one more list. How to leave without a scene. Because it wasn't enough to cut off the money. I needed to vanish cleanly, legally, emotionally. Not Switzerland. Too cliché. Lisbon. A furnished flat, language classes, a financial advisor. Freedom. I would give Lauren exactly what she asked for. I would die to her finances. Disappear from the role of rescuer. I knew I needed an ally. Someone who could act the part of the worried neighbor when the time came. My mind went immediately to Nora Hayes. Retired drama teacher. Lived 2 doors down. Had watched me carry groceries to Lauren's house for years without once being invited in. I called her. "Nora, can you come for tea?" Half an hour later she was sitting at my kitchen table, her gray hair piled on top of her head like a crown, eyes sharp as stage lights. "You sound different, Evelyn. What's going on?" I told her everything. Not just the plan but the words Lauren had said, the cake, the receipts. As I spoke, her lips pressed tighter and tighter. 45 years, she said finally. "And she told you to die." "Yes." Nora leaned back. "Then let's give her a funeral." We both laughed, a dry, brittle sound. But the laughter steadied me. We worked out the details. Nora would deliver the package to Lauren after I left. A 23-page letter, copies of the will and insurance changes, joint account closure, mortgage documents. And one final symbol. A wreath with the words "Rest in peace," "Free babysitter," and a snapped house key. "You wanted me gone?" I murmured as I wrote the note that would accompany the wreath. "Consider it done." Nora's theatrical instincts came alive. "I'll be the worried neighbor who found your empty apartment," she said. No argument. No confrontation. Just silence, paperwork, and a mirror. It was almost dusk when she left. My apartment smelled of tea and ink. The boxes of receipts were back in the closet, replaced on the table by a single suitcase. I stood at the window watching the streetlights flicker on one by one. For the first time since Lauren was born, I felt no compulsion to call her. No itch to check if she was eating or sleeping, no guilt about not being needed. Outside, a neighbor's child was riding a bike, wobbling but determined. The sky was streaked orange and purple. It was an ordinary evening. But inside me a tectonic plate had shifted. I whispered aloud, testing the words. My yes now belongs to me. Then I began to pack. By the time the sun rose the next morning, my apartment was no longer a home. It was a stage. My suitcase sat open on the bed like a hungry mouth. The walls, bare of the photos I'd quietly removed, looked already abandoned. Even the air felt thinner, as if it knew I was about to vanish. I moved methodically, almost ceremonially. Into the suitcase went my 3 best dresses, 2 pairs of slacks, and the silk scarf I'd bought but never worn because Lauren had once said it made me look too fancy for my age. I folded my documents, passport, bank information, medical papers, into a leather folder and slid it into the inner pocket. Everything else, old bills, worn-out sweaters, framed photos of a family that existed only in my memory, I left behind. I wasn't running. I was staging a death. My death as their rescuer, their free babysitter, their emergency fund. At 8 o'clock, Nora arrived carrying 2 paper bags of pastries. She always brought food when she sensed something momentous. She stood in the doorway, scanning the half-empty apartment. My God, she said softly. You're really doing it. I am, I answered. She set the bags down and took my hands. Walk me through it one more time. We sat at the kitchen table, which was now stripped of its tablecloth, just plain wood. Between us lay the envelope of documents we'd assembled last night. I went through each one like a lawyer preparing for trial. The 23-page letter explaining my decision. Copies of my new will, life insurance and trust documents. Proof of the closed joint account and mortgage rights. A certified letter to Mark about the co-signer terms. On top the wreath. White lilies, baby's breath, and a ribbon I'd written on in my own careful script. Rest in peace, free babysitter. The snapped house key hung from the bow like a tiny broken promise. I'll deliver it to her after you're gone, Nora said. And I'll play my part. The worried neighbor who found your empty apartment, who tried calling you but couldn't reach you. She'll get nothing from me except paperwork and silence. No speeches, I said. No explanations. No explanations, Nora repeated. We rehearsed her lines as if for a play. She would call Lauren mid-morning sounding breathless. I went by your mother's apartment and it's empty, she'd say. There's a letter for you. That was all. No drama. The theater teacher in her loved the minimalism of it. Evelyn, she said finally, her voice softer. Are you sure you're ready? I looked around at the apartment, its chipped teacups, its threadbare curtains, the ghost of a life built entirely around someone else. I've been ready for years, I said. She squeezed my hand. Then go. And don't look back. At noon I made my final walkthrough. The kitchen smelled faintly of the cake I'd thrown away. The bathroom mirror reflected a woman I barely recognized. Hair pinned up, face calm, eyes like polished stone. For decades my eyes had been soft, searching for approval. Now they were clear. I took out the small silver locket that had belonged to my mother and slipped it into my pocket. Not for Lauren, not for the twins. For me. Downstairs, the taxi waited with its trunk open. I carried my 2 suitcases, feeling their weight not as a burden but as proof. This is all I own that no one has claimed. Nora followed me out. The winter sunlight made her hair glow. Remember, she said. Once you're on that plane, turn your phone off. Don't give her a chance to beg or rage. Let the silence do the work. I nodded. She handed me a small notebook. For your new life, she said. Write everything down. Make sure this is never mistaken for impulse. I hugged her. She smelled like cinnamon and resolve. Thank you, I whispered. Don't thank me. Thank yourself for finally choosing you. I slid into the taxi. As we pulled away, I saw her in the rearview mirror holding the wreath and envelope against her chest like an offering. The image stayed with me long after she disappeared from view. At the airport, I moved through security like a ghost. Nobody looked at me twice. I was just another older woman with 2 suitcases and a passport, anonymous in the stream of travelers. On the plane, I took out Nora's notebook and began to write. Every step of the past week, every signature, every conversation. I wrote until my hand cramped, making sure there would be a record of my clarity. The flight to Lisbon was long but felt like one drawn-out exhale. When the plane lifted off the runway, I felt my chest loosen as if a belt had been cut. Below me, Texas shrank to a patchwork of fields and roads. Above me, only sky. I didn't sleep. I watched the clouds slide past and thought about Lauren waking up to her birthday wreath. Her missing mother, her sealed accounts. Maybe she would rage. Maybe she would panic. Maybe she wouldn't even notice for a while. It didn't matter. Somewhere over the Atlantic, I closed my eyes and imagined a different version of myself. A woman sitting at a cafe table in Alfama, learning Portuguese words for colors, painting watercolors of tiled streets, walking home alone without guilt or apology. I whispered the sentence again. My yes now belongs to me. When we landed, a man held a sign with my name. Tiago from the relocation agency. He smiled warmly and took my bags. Welcome to Lisbon, Mrs. Parker. He handed me keys to a furnished apartment in Alfama and a binder of resources. Language classes, a financial advisor, community groups for retirees. Everything is arranged, he said. I stepped out of the airport into the cool Portuguese morning. The sky was pale blue. The air smelled of salt and coffee. For the first time in decades, there was no one waiting for me to solve their crisis. No one texting me for a transfer. No one calling me too dramatic or over-involved. I was just Evelyn Parker, a 75-year-old woman with 2 suitcases and an unspent life. That evening, sitting at a cafe overlooking the Tagus River, I ordered grilled sardines and a glass of vinho verde. The waiter brought me a small vase of fresh flowers without my asking. I draped my old silk scarf over my shoulders. Lauren had once mocked it, and felt absurdly like royalty. My phone buzzed on the table. Dozens of messages. Calls from U.S. numbers. I let it ring. The sunset over the water mattered more than their demands. For once my day was my own. As the sun dropped behind the 25 de Abril bridge, I opened Nora's notebook and wrote one last line for the day. This is not escape. This is arrival. The first morning in Lisbon arrived like a whisper. Thin light crept through the lace curtains of my rented flat, casting delicate patterns on the parquet floor. I woke before the church bells, my body still attuned to Texas time, and for a moment I forgot where I was. Then I heard the seagulls. Their cries were sharp and foreign, and I smiled because they reminded me I was no longer on call. No midnight transfers, no emergency babysitting, no scolding voice telling me I was too dramatic. I padded barefoot to the balcony. Below, the steep streets of Alfama were still damp from an early rain. Laundry flapped on balconies, and somewhere a radio played a slow fado. I breathed in the scent of salt and coffee, feeling the air settle into my lungs like a benediction. On the small kitchen table lay the binder Tiago had given me at the airport. Bank contacts, rental agreements, classes, a list of English-speaking doctors. I opened it and touched each page like a set of keys. Each entry was a door to a life I had postponed for decades. I made myself a pot of strong Portuguese coffee and sat at the table. The steam rose in slow curls. I thought of Lauren waking up to her birthday wreath and the snapped key. Perhaps she was raging. Perhaps she was calling Nora over and over, demanding explanations. But in this kitchen, no phone rang. The silence was thick but not heavy. It was mine. I began to unpack methodically. Dresses into the wardrobe, shoes lined up neatly, toiletries in the bathroom. It felt like moving into a hotel room that might one day become a home. When I hung the silk scarf, the one Lauren mocked, on the hook by the door, it looked like a flag of independence. Later that morning, Tiago returned to check on me. "Did you sleep?" he asked in careful English. "A little," I said. "Enough." He walked me through the flat, how to work the gas stove, where to find the mailbox, which tram to take to the language school. His kindness was efficient, not intrusive. When he left, he gave me a small card. "Call me anytime," he said. "But enjoy your freedom first." Freedom. The word felt both strange and tender. Like an animal I wasn't sure would let me touch it. I spent the afternoon exploring the neighborhood on foot. The cobblestones were slick, the hills steep, but my legs felt lighter than they had in years. I passed tiled walls the color of the sea, tiny grocery stores selling oranges and sardines, children kicking a ball against a stone arch. Nobody knew me. Nobody expected anything. In a small shop I bought a bouquet of pink gerberas and on impulse a silk scarf for €90, simply because I liked it. As I handed over the cash, I felt a pang of guilt, an old reflex, as if Lauren might call and ask why I was wasting her money. Then I remembered. There would be no call. The scarf was mine. The money was mine. The choice was mine. That evening I found a cafe overlooking the Tagus. Wooden tables, candles and glass jars, the air warm with grilled fish and garlic. I ordered sea bream and a glass of vinho verde. The waiter placed a small plate of olives on the table and smiled at me as if I belonged there. My phone buzzed. U.S. numbers. Unknown numbers. I let it ring. The sun slid lower, painting the water copper. Each sip of wine felt like a small act of reclamation. Across the street, an accordion player began a slow tune. The music wound its way into the air, melancholy but alive. I closed my eyes and listened. For decades my life had been a schedule: hospital shifts, tuition deadlines, mortgage payments, babysitting weekends. Now the only appointment was with this moment. When the check arrived, I paid without looking at the total. It wasn't extravagance, it was proof. Proof that I could spend on myself without asking permission, without calculating how much would be left for Lauren's emergencies. Back in the flat, I opened Nora's notebook and began to write. I described the scent of the sea bream, the way the accordion sounded like a heartbeat, the feeling of walking through streets where no one knew my name. "This is not escape," I wrote again. "This is arrival." The next day I started my new routines. Then I went to my first Portuguese class. The classroom smelled of chalk and coffee. We were 8 students, retirees from Germany, a young woman from Brazil, an American couple who had sold everything to travel. The teacher, Marta, had quick hands and a patient smile. She taught us simple words. Bom dia, obrigada, saudade. I repeated them like prayers. After class I wandered into a tiny art supply shop and bought a set of watercolors. My hand shook slightly as I paid. I hadn't painted since Lauren was a child. I remembered how she used to sit next to me with her own brush, dipping it into the colors, making wild swirls. I had stopped painting when she went to college, telling myself I didn't have time. Now time stretched before me like a blank canvas. In the afternoons I walked along the waterfront or sat in a park sketching the tiled rooftops. Sometimes I bought a pastel de nata and ate it slowly, tasting the cinnamon on my tongue. Each small pleasure felt like a rebellion against decades of self-erasure. By the end of the first week, my phone had accumulated dozens of voicemails. I didn't listen. On the 7th day, curiosity won. I put the phone on speaker and sat at the kitchen table. Lauren's voice was tight, almost shrill. Mom, what is this? Nora says you're gone. Call me back immediately. Another message. This is ridiculous. We need to talk about the mortgage. You can't just disappear. Then softer. I didn't mean what I said. I was stressed. Please call me. I listened to them all. The tone shifted. Anger, panic, pleading. But nowhere did I hear a question about my health, my happiness, my plans. Only panic about money. I deleted them one by one. That evening, I cooked myself a simple dinner of grilled vegetables and rice. I set the table for one, lit a candle, poured a small glass of wine. It was not a sad meal. It was a declaration. The following morning, I received an email from Ben Carter, my lawyer. The subject line read, "Account closure confirmed / mortgage notice sent." He reminded me of the clauses we'd triggered. If payments lapsed, I could recover my down payment plus interest. Everything is in place, he wrote. Take care of yourself. I replied with 2 words. Thank you. As I hit send, another message from Lauren popped up on my screen. You're ruining our lives. I typed back slowly. No. I just stopped funding them. Then I closed the laptop and went out to the balcony to watch the sunset. Down below, a group of children were playing with a red ball. One of them looked up and waved. I waved back. For the first time in decades, I felt not like a ghost but like a person with a visible outline. That night I slept deeply without dreams. Days turned into a rhythm. Portuguese class 3 times a week. Walks along the river. Sketching sessions on Sundays with a small group of retirees. Every evening I wrote in Nora's notebook, documenting each step. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted a record of how a woman can step out of her own grave. Sometimes when I passed a mirror I barely recognized myself. The deep lines of worry on my forehead had begun to soften. My shoulders no longer curled inward. Even my voice when I spoke to the shopkeepers sounded steadier. In Lisbon, nobody called me too much. Nobody asked for a loan. Nobody measured my worth by my willingness to sacrifice. Freedom was not loud. It was quiet. It was walking into a store and buying flowers without guilt. It was saying bom dia to a stranger and meaning it. It was letting the phone ring and not picking up. One evening, as I sat at the cafe where I'd eaten my first sea bream, I wrote in the notebook, "Sunset over the Tagus matters more than my daughter's demands." Underneath I drew a small sketch of the bridge, the water glowing orange. For the first time since I could remember, my handwriting was fluid, almost elegant. I closed the notebook and lifted my glass to the fading light. To life, I whispered. To my life. It began the way storms do. Quietly, almost politely. A single message. Then another. By the third, my phone buzzed so constantly it seemed to vibrate with Lauren's panic. Nora had delivered the package exactly as we planned. She told me later that she'd slipped the wreath into Lauren's arms before Lauren even realized what she was holding. White lilies, baby's breath, the snapped key gleaming like bone. Beneath it, the thick envelope of legal documents. Lauren's expression, Nora said, had curdled from confusion to rage within seconds. From Lisbon, I felt the impact as if across an ocean a door had been slammed so hard the echo traveled. First I ignored the phone. I was on the balcony sipping coffee, watching the morning unfold. Vendors setting up stalls, children running down cobblestone streets, a man strumming a guitar for coins. The ordinary beauty of it seemed like armor against whatever was breaking in Texas. But the buzzing grew unbearable. By noon I turned the phone face up and watched the screen light up again and again. Lauren, Mark, unknown numbers, even the twins' school. 43 missed calls in a single morning. Finally I answered. Mom. Her voice was breathless, as if she had been running. What is this? What is this stunt you're pulling? I let the silence stretch. You closed the account? You changed your will? You left a wreath on my doorstep like you're dead? Do you know how humiliating this is? Her voice cracked, but not from grief. From fury. I spoke slowly, each word steady. Do you need me, Lauren, or do you need my money? There was a pause so sharp it might as well have been a confession. Then, we need you. We're family. We can work this out. No, I said. You need my money. You've shown me very clearly that the person behind the money is disposable. Mom, that's not fair. I was stressed. You always twist everything. You've always been so dramatic. I cut her off. 3 times I was in the hospital, Lauren. Pneumonia at 61. Gallbladder surgery at 64. The fall that broke my hip at 72. 3 times. You never came. Not once. Do you remember? Her silence was answer enough. I'm done, I said and hung up. That evening I walked to the cafe by the river and ordered grilled sea bream, potatoes and vinho verde. The waiter lit a candle on my table, though I hadn't asked. Around me couples laughed. Tourists snapped photos of the sunset. I ate slowly, savoring each bite as if I were teaching my body a new language. The language of enough. By the time I returned to the flat, my phone showed 62 messages. I opened them one by one. From Lauren. You're ruining our lives. From Mark. This isn't just about you. You're putting the kids at risk. From an unknown number I recognized as her lawyer's office. We need to discuss your estate changes immediately. I answered none of them. The next morning another message arrived. This one colder. If you don't undo this, you'll regret it. I deleted it and opened my journal. I wrote, they think they are punishing me. But what they don't understand is that the punishment was the life I already lived, years of silence, years of giving without receiving. This is not punishment. This is resurrection. Still, the flood of messages did not stop. By the 3rd day the tone had shifted again. Less rage, more pleading. Mom, please, the mortgage is due. Mark's unemployment check isn't enough. We'll lose the house. I could almost see her pacing that beautiful kitchen I had paid for. Wine glass in hand, panic rising. Once that panic would have been contagious. I would have reached for my checkbook before she finished the sentence. But here in Lisbon, the panic felt like a bird flying into a closed window. Loud but contained. I typed back just 2 words, not mine. Within minutes she replied, you're heartless. We've sacrificed so much for you. I laughed aloud, startling myself. Sacrificed? I pictured the boxes of receipts in my closet. The ledger of my life, the $700,000 drained from my bones. Sacrificed. The word was so absurd it became almost funny. That night, lying in bed, I imagined her face reading my letter, flipping through the notarized documents, realizing that every lifeline had been cut. I imagined Mark's voice, angry, accusing her of losing the golden goose. I imagined the twins asking questions she could not answer. For once it was not me who lay awake, calculating solutions. It was her. I turned over, pulled the blanket up to my chin, and slept soundly. Days later, I finally answered one of Mark's calls. His voice was sharp, almost rehearsed. Evelyn, this isn't sustainable. We can't carry the mortgage without your help. You've always said family is everything. I did, I said. And then I learned that in our family, family meant me paying while everyone else took. You can't just abandon us. Think of the kids. I am, I said quietly. That's why I left them a trust. They'll be fine. It's you two who are not. He muttered something about selfishness, about betrayal. I hung up before he finished. That evening I sat on the balcony with a cup of tea and watched the lights of Lisbon blink on. Below, neighbors chatted on stoops, laughter rising into the night air. None of them knew me, yet their voices sounded warmer than my daughter's had in years. I wrote in Nora's notebook. Silence is louder than begging. Paperwork is stronger than tears. By the end of the week, the storm had reached its peak. Messages from Lauren filled every channel: voicemail, text, email, even a desperate post on Facebook. If anyone knows how to reach my mother, please tell her we need her. I almost answered. Almost. Then I closed the laptop and poured another glass of wine. Because the truth was simple. She didn't need me. She needed the version of me that worked herself into the ground, the version that paid, the version that disappeared whenever convenient. That woman was gone. What remained was Evelyn Parker. Alive. Abroad. Beginning again. It didn't take long for silence to turn into retaliation. Manipulators never accept absence. They try to turn it into guilt or madness. One afternoon my Lisbon phone rang. An unfamiliar American number. I hesitated, then answered. Mrs. Parker? The voice was measured, official. This is Helen Grant, social worker with the U.S. Consulate. Your daughter contacted our office. She expressed concern that you may be suffering from dementia and are living unsafely abroad. We've been asked to follow up. For a moment I couldn't breathe. Dementia. The word hit me harder than all the insults Lauren had ever thrown at me. Dementia meant erasure. It meant courts, guardianship, signatures stolen. It meant she wasn't content to cut me out emotionally. She wanted to erase me legally. I see, I said slowly. What would this follow-up involve? An evaluation, she explained. Medical and psychological. Voluntary, of course. But in these situations, cooperation helps clarify everything. I thought of Lauren's text. You'll regret this. This was what she meant. She wasn't just lashing out, she was laying siege. I'll cooperate fully, I said. Set the appointment. That evening I called Ben Carter, my lawyer in Austin. His voice was calm, steady as ever. Evelyn, don't panic. They're trying to build a case of incompetence so they can contest your will, and maybe even petition for guardianship over your assets. But we've prepared for this. Everything you've done is documented, dated, signed, notarized. They're saying I'm senile. My voice cracked despite myself. And we'll prove you're not. We'll use their false report against them. Cooperate with every evaluation. The truth will be your shield. 2 days later, I sat in a bright room at the U.S. Consulate in Lisbon. The doctor was Portuguese but spoke clear English. He wore thin glasses and had a gentle manner, the kind of man who could ask you your name and make it sound like an invitation instead of a test. He asked me to recall dates, draw a clock face, solve simple math. Then harder questions. Interpret a proverb. Explain what I'd do if I found a stamped letter on the street. I answered each one carefully, not to impress, but to reveal the clarity I felt inside. When it was over, he smiled faintly. Mrs. Parker, you are fully competent. Your memory, reasoning, and judgment are excellent for your age. Better, in fact, than many younger patients I see. The report was sent to Washington. Case closed. False report flagged. But the damage wasn't only in the accusation. It was in the realization. My own daughter had sat at her kitchen island, wine glass in hand, and told strangers across the world that her mother was incapable of thought, that she needed to be managed like a child. That night, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on my balcony. Lisbon glowed below me, rooftops glistening from a late rain. The Tagus reflected the lights like a mirror. I whispered aloud. She would rather declare me insane than accept that I said no. The next morning Ben called again. We can take this further, he said. A defamation suit. False reporting with intent to interfere in your estate. It will send a message that you are not to be treated as incompetent property. I hesitated. Isn't that revenge? No, Ben said firmly. It's protection. You're building a wall that lies can't climb. If you don't respond, she'll keep escalating. If you do, she'll know you have teeth. So I agreed. He began drafting. Meanwhile, the phone kept buzzing. Lauren again, this time sugar-coated. Mom, it was all a misunderstanding. The lawyer pushed us into it. We just want to make sure you're okay. I answered once, just once, to strip the mask. You reported me as demented, I said. Her pause was long. Then, I didn't mean it like that. How else do you mean it? I asked. Dementia is not a slip of the tongue. It's a calculated word. You wanted to steal my voice and call it concern. Her silence was my answer. I hung up. The defamation paperwork moved forward. Ben collected every voicemail, every text. The wreath, the snapped key, the notarized will changes. Each became part of the file. Evidence that I was not impulsive but deliberate. The more Lauren tried to claw back control, the more the law pinned her desperation to the wall. One evening, Tiago stopped by to deliver some translated mail. He looked at me kindly. Is everything okay? You seem heavier this week. I almost told him everything but stopped. Lisbon was my sanctuary, not my courtroom. Instead, I said, sometimes freedom comes with ghosts. He nodded as if he understood. That night I wrote in Nora's notebook. They tried to K***l me with lies. But I answered with truth. Each document is a wee *p* and sharper than their words. A week later, the consulate doctor called me personally. His voice was almost fatherly. Mrs. Parker, your evaluation was flawless. Please know this. You are not the first and you won't be the last to face this kind of false report. Children often mistake boundaries for illness. Don't let their fear of losing control make you doubt your clarity. I thanked him, and after I hung up I cried. Not from sadness, but from the weight of vindication. For so long I had doubted myself, wondered if maybe I was too dramatic, too needy, too much. But here, stamped and signed, was proof. My mind was intact. My decisions were sound. Lauren's "we*p*n had backfired. I walked that evening through Alfama's narrow alleys. Lanterns swung overhead. Couples leaned against tiled walls, whispering. The air smelled of grilled sardines and cinnamon. I bought myself a custard tart and ate it slowly, the sugar clinging to my lips. For the first time, the sweetness didn't taste guilty. Tasted like defiance. Back at the flat, I sat at the table, opened the notebook and wrote. She wanted leverage. I chose the law. She wanted to erase me. I carved my name deeper. When I closed the book, the church bells tolled 9. Each chime sounded less like a warning and more like a hymn. I wasn't afraid anymore. Because now I knew. They could report me, insult me, call me insane, even try to drag me into courtrooms. But the truth was no longer a fragile thing inside me. It was written, signed, sealed. And it belonged to me. When the case was closed and the doctor's report sat in my hands like a shield, a new kind of silence entered my life. Not the suffocating silence of being ignored or dismissed, but a fertile one, like soil after rain. For the first time in decades, my days weren't dictated by my daughter's emergencies, my son-in-law's excuses, or the twins' schedules. They belonged to me. At first, I didn't know what to do with the hours. I would wake early, pour coffee, and sit by the balcony staring at the Tagus. My body twitched with old reflexes. Should I check my phone in case Lauren needed me? Should I calculate if I could cover another mortgage payment? Then I would remember no. That Evelyn had died. So I began to fill the days with deliberate choices. I signed up for Portuguese classes 3 times a week. Marta, the teacher, had a voice like a violin, firm, lilting, impossible to ignore. She taught us not only words but gestures, intonations, the music of the language. I practiced bom dia to strangers on the tram, and each return smile felt like a deposit into a bank of confidence I had never owned before. Next, I joined a watercolor group that met on Sundays. We gathered in a park, 8 of us spread out with brushes and paper, sketching the tiled rooftops or the crooked trees. The first time my brush touched water, my hand trembled. But the color bled across the paper in soft blues and golds, and suddenly I remembered. I used to love this. Before bills, before endless sacrifices, before being reduced to a purse with hands, I was a woman who created. By the second week, my calendar began to bloom. Portuguese on Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays. Watercolors on Sundays. A book club on Thursdays where we sipped Vinho Verde and argued about translations of Pessoa. On Saturdays, a hiking group for 60+ that took buses into the countryside. I wrote each activity into a small planner. For decades, that planner had been filled with Lauren's appointments. Dentist for the twins, recital tickets, college tuition deadlines. Now each square held my name, my choice. I found myself lingering over the pages at night, touching the ink as if to make sure it was real. It was on one of those hikes that I met Ingrid. Tall, silver-haired, with a stride that cut through the hills like a blade. We fell into step together, And within an hour I knew her story. 2 adult sons who treated her like an ATM, a daughter-in-law who called her the walking pension. She had left Norway 6 months earlier, buying a one-way ticket to Lisbon after her youngest demanded she sell her house to fund his startup. As she spoke, I felt my chest loosen. "So it's not just me," I whispered. Ingrid laughed, bitter and bright. "Oh, my dear, there are armies of us. Mothers who gave everything until we realized our children wanted not love, but endless withdrawals." We exchanged numbers. Soon we were meeting twice a week for coffee, trading stories like battle scars. With her, I didn't have to explain why my daughter's voice still echoed in my head. She already knew. It was Ingrid who urged me to write publicly. "You have such clarity," she said one afternoon as we sat overlooking the water. "Other women need to hear it. They need to know they're not crazy, that generosity without boundaries is a slow suicide." That night, I opened my laptop and wrote an essay. I called it "When a Mother's Love Turns to Self-Destruction." I wrote about receipts piled higher than gratitude, about being told to die as a birthday wish, about closing the accounts and finally breathing. I didn't soften the edges. I wrote with the merciless clarity I had been denied all those years. I sent it to a women's blog Ingrid recommended. Within days it went viral. Comments poured in. "I stopped paying my 35-year-old son's bills last week. I thought I was cruel. Now I think I might be sane. I sold the big house, live within my means, and I finally sleep at night. I wish my mother had read this before she died. Maybe she would have saved herself." I sat at my laptop reading those words, my hands trembling. For years I had been told I was dramatic, selfish, overbearing. Now strangers across the world were telling me, "No, you were drowning and you finally swam." The blog editor wrote to me, then a podcaster, then a YouTube channel. Within a month, I was sitting in front of a small camera in my Lisbon apartment, telling my story to millions. My face, my voice, my truth, finally louder than Lauren's dismissals. The irony was sharp. The daughter who said I was embarrassing, too much, irrelevant, now had to watch as her mother became a voice others sought out, a woman strangers thanked for saving them from the same trap. One evening an email arrived. Not from Lauren. From Mark. "Evelyn," it began, "I know you don't owe me anything, but I want you to hear this. Lauren manipulated you and she manipulated me too. I went along with it because it was easier. I let her use your money, your time, your health. I didn't stop her. I'm ashamed. One day when the twins are old enough, I'll tell them the truth, that you didn't abandon them, you saved yourself. They deserve to know." I stared at the screen for a long time. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. In the end I typed only "Thank you, but I am not coming back." Because it wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about recovery. The calendar filled and so did my lungs. Each week I painted a little better. My Portuguese grew a little stronger. My steps up the hills a little steadier. I laughed with Ingrid until my sides ached. I spoke on camera about boundaries and watched women cry in recognition. Sometimes late at night I still heard Lauren's voice. "The best present would be if you just died." But now it sounded less like a curse and more like a confession of her own emptiness. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through my window, I looked at the planner spread open on the table. It was full of my handwriting, my choices, my life. I touched the pages and whispered, "Finally, my calendar is mine." 6 months after my arrival in Lisbon, the first real tremor from Texas reached me. I was drinking coffee with Ingrid at a small cafe when my phone lit up with Nora's name. I stepped outside to answer. "Evelyn," she said in a low voice, "it's starting. The foreclosure notice went up this morning." For a moment I leaned against the wall, the phone hot against my ear. I could almost see it. The bright orange paper taped to the door of the beautiful Austin house, the one whose down payment I had covered, the one with the marble counters and the wide windows. "Foreclosure," I repeated slowly. "Yes," Nora said. "Neighbors are whispering. Lauren is crying to anyone who'll listen, saying you abandoned them." I closed my eyes and exhaled. But the payments? Missed. Again and again. No backup plan. No savings. Just waiting for you to swoop in like always. I whispered, "Not anymore." Back at the cafe table, Ingrid raised her eyebrows. "Bad news." "Necessary news," I said. And I meant it. Over the next weeks, Nora kept me updated. Mark had picked up a part-time job at a hardware store. Lauren was working at a boutique, her smile stretched thin. The neighbors had grown cold. Everyone knew how I'd been treated. Instead of sympathy, she found suspicion. Meanwhile, Ben filed the paperwork to recover my down payment plus interest. Exactly as we'd prepared. It was almost clinical signatures certified mail, a chain of custody. The law was no longer there, P*N. It was mine. When the court ruled in my favor, the funds transferred into my Portuguese account. I stared at the balance on the screen, tears in my eyes. Not because of the money, but because for the first time in my life it was mine. Not earmarked for Lauren's tuition, not already promised for braces, not swallowed by a mortgage. Mine. Around the same time, my old apartment in Austin sold. More funds arrived, neat and precise, into the account Ben had secured for me. I sat at my kitchen table in Lisbon, the window open to the evening breeze, and whispered, "This is what safety feels like." But across the ocean, chaos was unfolding. Lauren and Mark downsized into a cramped apartment complex. The twins, accustomed to their big bedrooms and manicured lawn, suddenly shared a small room overlooking a parking lot. At first they were confused, then angry. "Why can't Grandma fix this?" Nora overheard them asking. And Lauren, cornered, offered half-truths. "Grandma doesn't want to help anymore. She abandoned us." But neighbors corrected the story. Some even showed the twins the article I'd written that had gone viral. "Your grandmother didn't abandon you," one said gently. "She chose to save herself." I imagined Lauren's face as she realized the narrative was slipping from her hands. For years she had controlled the story. That I was dramatic, needy, meddling. Now across oceans my voice was louder than hers. One evening I sat on my balcony in Lisbon and thought of the house. The one I had helped fill with furniture, toys, dinners, Christmas trees. Now empty, echoing, about to be auctioned. For years I'd believed that house was proof of my love. But walls don't hold love when people inside treat it like debt. I whispered into the night air. Let it fall. Because in truth it wasn't the foreclosure that destroyed that family. It was entitlement. It was the belief that my love was infinite money, that my boundaries were optional. The house didn't collapse because I left. It collapsed because they built it on my back instead of their own. I thought of the twins often. I pictured them adjusting, learning to share space, maybe discovering resilience their parents never taught them. Children bend. It's the adults who break. I prayed silently that one day they would understand, that they'd see my absence not as cruelty but as the only honest gift I could give. Meanwhile, my days in Lisbon grew brighter. I painted the narrow streets in watercolor, their tiled walls glowing blue and gold. I read novels with my book club, laughing until my sides ached. Ingrid and I took trains to seaside towns, walking barefoot on the sand. Each morning I opened my calendar and saw only my handwriting, my choices. Sometimes guilt would try to creep in. Late at night I would hear Lauren's voice. "Mom, we need you. You're ruining our lives." But then I would remind myself, no, I stopped funding them. That's all. And their collapse wasn't proof of my cruelty. It was proof of their dependence. A letter arrived from Ben, crisp and official. Inside was the final statement. Foreclosure complete. Funds reimbursed, case closed. At the bottom he'd written by hand. "Evelyn, boundaries didn't destroy your family. Entitlement did." I pinned that line above my desk. Months later, Ingrid and I walked through the Alfama streets at dusk. Lanterns glowed overhead, and the smell of grilled sardines hung in the air. She touched my arm and said, "Do you ever regret leaving so completely?" I thought for a moment. "Sometimes," I admitted. But regret isn't the same as doubt. Regret is remembering the child I once held. Doubt would be wondering if I did the right thing. And I don't doubt. She smiled. "Then you're free." And I realized she was right. The house in Austin was gone. My old apartment was gone. My money for once was mine. Lauren and Mark were working again, their world smaller, their days harder. The twins were learning to adapt. The world hadn't collapsed without me. It had simply stopped living on my back. I stood that night on my balcony, watching the city lights scatter across the river. I thought of the house, dark and abandoned, waiting for auction. I thought of Lauren pacing a small apartment, no longer queen of her borrowed palace. I thought of myself here, alive, breathing freely. And I whispered once more, "Let it fall." The money was steady now. Between the reimbursement from the foreclosure, the sale of my old apartment, and careful investments Ben helped arrange, I had something I'd never truly possessed. Stable savings that belonged only to me. Not earmarked for Lauren's tuition. Not devoured by braces or mortgages. Mine. At 76, that truth was both liberating and sobering. How many decades had I spent building safety for others while living in scarcity myself? I could have traveled. I could have studied art in Florence or walked the Camino, or simply bought myself flowers without guilt. Instead, I had receipts, boxes of them. Proof that I had turned my life into a ledger of sacrifice. But here in Lisbon I had time left. And I refused to waste it. It started with a question from Ingrid. We were sitting at our favorite cafe near the cathedral sipping coffee, when she leaned across the table. You've already written for blogs, given interviews. Why not something bigger? Why not a book? A book. I laughed, shaking my head. Yes, she said. Not just your story. A manual. A roadmap. You could help women like us recognize the hooks before they bleed themselves dry. The idea lodged itself in my mind. That evening I sat at my desk with Nora's old notebook open in front of me. Page after page of my handwriting stared back. Lists, reflections, strategies. What if I shaped it into something deliberate, something others could hold in their hands when they were drowning? So I began. Every morning I wrote for 3 hours. I described the traps, the guilt hooks, but we're family. The gaslighting, you're too dramatic. The entitlement disguised as love, you do this if you really cared. I detailed how to prepare an exit, legal, financial, emotional. How to rewrite wills, close accounts, protect yourself from guardianship claims. How to survive the tidal wave of guilt when you finally say no. I wrote about the nights I sat in my apartment with receipts piled high like gravestones. About the morning I walked away from Lauren's door with a melting cake in my hands. About Lisbon sunsets that tasted like freedom. But I didn't stop at memoir. I created worksheets, checklists, scripts. If they say this, you can answer this. If they threaten this, here's the legal term to use. I wanted it to be more than my catharsis. I wanted it to be a toolkit for liberation. First, I thought no one would publish it. Who would care about the confessions of a 76-year-old woman who had finally grown a spine? But when I showed Ingrid a draft, she wept. Evelyn, this is not just a book. This is medicine. Through contacts at the Women's Blog, I found a Lisbon-based publisher specializing in memoirs and self-help. The editor, a brisk woman named Clara, read my manuscript in a weekend and called me Monday morning. Mrs. Parker, she said. This is raw, merciless, necessary. We'll take it. I hung up the phone and cried. Not the bitter tears I had shed so often, but tears of release. For the first time, the meticulousness that had once drained me was building something that would outlive me. When the book was published, it bore a simple title, Boundaries Are Love. The cover showed a cracked chain falling open against a white background. I held the first copy in my hands and traced the letters with my finger. It felt heavier than any receipt I had ever saved. Letters began pouring in. Women from everywhere, Kansas, Dublin, Sao Paulo, wrote to me. I stopped paying my 35-year-old son's rent after reading your words. I thought he'd hate me. Instead, he got a job. I finally sleep at night. I sold the big house, moved into an apartment I could afford, and for the first time in years, I bought myself a piano. I'm free. My mother died last year. I found your book too late. I realized she lived the way you did, erasing herself. I wish I had told her she didn't need to. One letter from a 30-year-old woman struck deepest. She wrote that after reading my story, she apologized to her own mother before it was too late. She cried and told me she had been waiting for that apology for 20 years. We healed before her funeral, not after. You gave me that. I read those lines again and again, pressing the page to my chest. My pain had become someone else's survival. My scars had become a map. The publisher organized small readings across Portugal. I stood in libraries and bookstores, my voice shaking at first, then steady. Women lined up afterward to hug me, whispering their stories into my ear. Some had adult children who drained them. Others had siblings or husbands who manipulated them. All of them carried the same hollow guilt I had once mistaken for love. And I told each one the same thing. Love without boundaries is not love. It's destruction. You deserve to live. The irony did not escape me. For decades, I had been the silent background to my daughter's drama, erased in her home, invisible in her life. Now I was on stages, in bookstores, my words amplified, my truth undeniable. Lauren had tried to declare me insane. Instead, I had become an author whose sanity saved strangers. Financially, the book did well enough to matter. Royalties trickled in, small compared to the sums I had given away over the years, but these earnings were clean. They carried no resentment, no manipulation, just gratitude. One evening, Ingrid came over with a bottle of wine. We sat on my balcony, the city glowing below us. She raised her glass. "To your book," she said. "No," I corrected gently. "To survival." We clinked glasses. That night, I lay in bed holding a copy of Boundaries Are Love against my chest. I thought of Lauren's voice calling me dramatic, ungrateful, disposable. And I thought of strangers across the world now whispering, "Thank you. You saved me." The same discipline that once shackled me had become my freedom. The same meticulousness that built Lauren's life now fueled mine. For the first time, I believed that my suffering had not been wasted. It had been transformed. The first letter arrived in an envelope decorated with clumsy stickers, dinosaurs, stars, crooked hearts. The handwriting was jagged, uncertain, clearly the work of children. For a moment I just held it, afraid to open it. My hands trembled the way they had when I used to unwrap Lauren's school reports, bracing for both pride and disappointment. Inside were 2 sheets of notebook paper, written in the uneven scrawl of my grandsons. "Dear Grandma, we miss you. Dad told us the truth. Mom said things she shouldn't have. We are proud of you. We want to visit someday. Love, Tyler and James." My vision blurred. Tears slid down my face, but not the guilty kind. These were tears of relief. Because here at last was proof. Love survives honesty. Even across oceans, even through lies. I sat at my desk in Lisbon, the late afternoon light pooling across the page. My fingers traced their words. "We are proud of you." My grandsons, only 13, had already grasped what their mother still could not. That survival is not betrayal. That evening I wrote back. I chose my words carefully, as though each one could build a plank in a bridge. "My dear boys, I love you more than you can know. My heart and home will always be open to you when you are old enough to choose. I am living in Portugal now, learning new things, painting, meeting good people. One day, if you want, you can see it too. Until then, remember that love is not measured by money, but by truth. And the truth is, you are always in my heart." I sealed the envelope with hands that no longer shook. For years I had confused silence with protection. I thought if I swallowed my hurt, Lauren would be kinder. I thought if I financed her world, the twins would see me as indispensable. But children see through shadows. They notice who shows up, who sacrifices, who disappears. Now, without manipulation clouding their vision, they had chosen to see me as I was. Not as a bank account, but as a grandmother. Word of the letter must have reached Lauren. Within a week, she tried a new angle. She didn't call me directly. She circled through neighbors, acquaintances, even old church friends from Austin. Messages trickled back across the ocean. "Lauren wants to talk. She says she regrets things. She's ready to make amends." But when Nora confronted her, blunt as ever, Lauren's mask cracked. "Some words you can't take back," Nora told her. "You told your mother to die. She heard you. She believed you. That bell cannot be unrung." The neighbors agreed. By then, everyone had watched the foreclosure, the legal battle, the unraveling. Sympathy for Lauren had dried up. She was left with her boutique shifts, her downsized apartment, and her reputation. Meanwhile, my life kept blooming. I spoke at a conference in Porto, where women stood in line afterward to hold my hands and whisper their stories. I took a short trip to Seville with Ingrid, where we wandered through orange-scented courtyards and laughed until midnight. Each day I painted more confidently, my watercolors growing bolder, less hesitant. But it was the twins' letter that steadied me most. I carried it folded in my wallet, a talisman. Whenever doubt tried to creep in, the old reflex that whispered I had abandoned them, I touched the paper and remembered. Bridges still existed. Not to Lauren, but to them. I refused to poison those bridges with bitterness. So I kept my words to them pure, free of reproach. I wrote about Portuguese festivals, about learning to cook bacalhau, about the seagulls that stole bread from cafe tables. I wanted them to associate me not with conflict but with possibility. Because one day, when they were free of their parents' voices, I wanted them to walk toward me without fear. Ingrid noticed the change. "You look lighter," she said one morning as we walked along the river. "I think it's because I've stopped mourning what's already dead," I replied. "I'm planting bridges for what's still alive." She smiled. "That's wisdom." I shook my head. "No. It's survival." At night, I sometimes imagine the future. The twins grown, arriving in Lisbon with backpacks and curious eyes. Sitting with me at this very balcony, listening to Fado, asking about the grandmother they had half forgotten. I wouldn't tell them tales of betrayal. I wouldn't poison them with their mother's cruelty. I would tell them stories of resilience, of mistakes turned into lessons. I would hand them brushes and watercolors and say, "Paint your own life. Don't repeat mine." That thought comforted me more than any legal victory or bank balance. Weeks later, I received another envelope. This one slimmer, with only 2 words scrawled in the twins' uneven hand. "We believe you." I pressed it to my chest and wept. Because in the end that was all I had ever wanted, to be believed. Not gaslit, not dismissed, not reduced to dramatic. Believed. Lauren still tried, of course. She left voicemail messages filled with tears, insisting she had changed, that we could start over. But the neighbors told me she still spoke of me as her lost investment, her cut-off lifeline. Regret was just another mask, and I had stopped mistaking masks for faces. So I left the phone unanswered. Instead, I invested in the future that was still possible. I set aside a small savings account in Portugal, marked with the twins' names, locked until they turned 25. Not as bait, not as leverage, but as a quiet assurance. When they were ready, there would be something waiting. A bridge steady and unbreakable. Some evenings, I stood on my balcony watching the city glow. I pictured those boys walking across that bridge one day, without trolls of manipulation or tolls of guilt. Just their own choice, their own steps. Until then, I would live. Fully. Unapologetically. Not waiting for apologies that might never come. Not begging for crumbs of gratitude. One chapter of my life had closed. But another was still unwritten. The chapter where innocence could find its way back. Where truth could outlast lies. Where bridges could be crossed freely without chains. And I would be here. Whole. Waiting but not wasting. 3 years have passed. I am 78 now. And each morning I sit on my Lisbon balcony watching the Tagus carry ships out to sea. The river is always moving. Always letting go, never clinging. I take lessons from it. When I left Texas, I thought I was escaping. In truth, I was dying to the role that had erased me. Now I see it clearly. I buried the self who lived for their approval, and in her place rose a woman who finally breathes without permission. I am not poor. Ben's careful investments, the sale of my old apartment, and the funds I recovered from the house have grown. My assets stand at more than $700,000. But more important than the number is the fact that it is mine. Mine after a lifetime of being siphoned away. Sometimes I still hear Lauren's words in my head. The best present would be if you just died. They used to echo like a curse. Now they sound almost ironic. Because she got her wish. I did die, to her demands, her manipulation, her entitlement. To her I am gone. But in Lisbon I am alive. My calendar is filled not with obligations but with choices. Portuguese classes twice a week, though my accent still makes Marta laugh. Watercolor groups on Sundays. Book clubs on Thursdays where we argue fiercely about Saramago. Walks with Ingrid in the countryside. Our voices carrying across the hills like women who refuse to be silenced. The book I wrote, Boundaries Are Love, is still in print. Sometimes I receive letters from readers, women who say they finally cut the cord that strangled them. One wrote, "I used your worksheets to say no to my daughter for the first time. She screamed, but I slept. Thank you for giving me sleep." Those letters mean more to me than any award. They are proof that my suffering was not wasted. And the twins? They are nearly grown. They write occasionally, emails now, not letters. Short notes. School is hard but we're okay. We can't wait to travel someday. We're saving money. Each message is another plank in the bridge. I don't press them. I simply answer, "I love you. I'm proud of you. My home is open when you're ready." Lauren still circles from a distance. Nora tells me she occasionally asks neighbors about me, feigning casual interest. But the truth is she knows she lost. Not just the money, not just the house, but the narrative. She can't paint me as crazy anymore. The world has read my words and found them sane. She can't paint me as selfish. My grandchildren know the truth. On her 48th birthday, I sent her nothing. But she received something anyway. Nora delivered the final package I had left behind, timed for that date. Inside was a single wreath smaller than the first, with one snapped key and a page of paper. On it I had written, "You asked me to disappear. I did. Now look at what really disappeared from your life." Nora told me Lauren tore it up in the driveway. But tearing paper doesn't erase truth. When I think of her now, I don't feel rage. Rage is still a form of attachment. What I feel is colder. Distance. Like a country I no longer visit, whose language I no longer speak. Some nights when the bells of the cathedral ring across Alfama, I sit with a glass of wine and think about my life. About the girl I once was, dreaming of motherhood as a sacred calling. About the woman who worked triple shifts, who pawned her jewelry for tuition, who bent her back under the weight of another family's comfort. About the mother who carried a $300 cake to a door, and was met with the words, "Oh, it's you." That woman is gone. She deserved better, but she is gone. In her place sits someone harder, quieter, freer. I do not regret the money I gave. I regret the silence I kept. I regret every time I excused cruelty because it came from my child. I regret that I mistook dependency for love. But regret is not the same as despair. Regret is a scar, not an open wound. The irony still bites. It took dying in my daughter's eyes to live in my own. I am 78 and for the first time I am not afraid of the future. If tomorrow brings illness, I will face it with dignity. If death comes, it will not be because someone wished it on me but because life is finite. Until then I will walk these cobblestones, paint these tiled walls, argue over novels, drink wine by the river. I will not apologize for surviving. Lauren wanted me dead. She got her wish. To her I am a ghost. But to myself I am more alive than I ever dared to be. So this is my final reflection. Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to die to the role that erased you. To bury the obedient mother, the endless provider, the silent victim. To let her rest, and to rise as the woman who chooses. And if anyone calls that selfish, so be it. Because selfishness at last saved my life.